Yeah, if you don't already know me, my name is Cynthia Peters. I'm the editor of The Change Agent, and I do a lot of professional development as well for regions and states and nationally. And in this past year or two, I've done a lot about how the field of adult education can do more to address racial equity. And so that's what we're going to be talking about a little bit more today. Let me go into and we're a small group, so I really encourage you to please just unmute yourself anytime you want and interrupt me. I'm not the kind of presenter who can't stand to be interrupted or anything like that. I actually appreciate being interrupted. I feel like it makes us more in conversation with each other, and we are a small enough group where we really can just be in conversation with each other. And I have built-in opportunities for us to be in conversation, but please feel free to just make that happen at any point along the way. So I want to, before I get started, just give a shout out to Reva Pearson, who is a dear friend of mine up here in Massachusetts and who has co-presented with me several times, and who is a wonderful ESL teacher and has developed some really great materials. And I've learned a lot from her, and her work and her essence is infused in this presentation. I bet all of you might already know this, how to access the Change Agent, but in case you didn't, I wanted to remind you, and I'm going to ask Joan to put in the link to the top page of the Change Agent in the chat, and just remind you all that the username is Rhode Island, all in lowercase, and the password is Change Agent. And what you can do is, even right now, as we speak, if you're on your own computer or your phone or whatever you're on, you can click on the link, the Change Agent top page, and in the upper right-hand corner, you can type in Rhode Island in the username and Change Agent as a password and hit enter. And hopefully it will prompt you to, do you want to save this password, and just say yes. And then, you don't even have to remember it after that. It's just, you'll always be able to access all the Change Agent materials. Also, make sure to share this with all your students, with any fellow teachers. The state of Rhode Island has bought a bulk subscription for all of you to use. So anybody in a state-funded program is allowed to use this in the most maximum possible way. If anybody, if you try to log in right now and you have any trouble or anything, or even if you did manage to log in, you want to come back to the chat and just say, I did it, or something like that, that would be great to know. Or maybe if you already are logged in, then that's good to know too. I just want to really make sure everybody knows about that. So our agenda for today is, first, I'm going to share 4 general strategies about taking on the task of addressing racial equity in the classroom. And we're going to pay some special attention to student resistance and, what you might call having hard conversations in the classroom. And then I also want to delve into 4 more specific strategies and some actual materials that I want to send you off on a field trip to kind of look at and think about and come back and talk about together. And so, and at the very end, we have an evaluation that Joan is going to share with you. So the learning objectives are just that you will leave with, a sense of these 4 general strategies, also the 4 specific strategies, and as well as some concrete ideas about how to navigate difficult conversations. I'm sure all of you, as people in adult ed and many, many years and hours in the classroom, have had many difficult conversations. So I know you already know a lot about how to navigate those, but we'll dive into that a little more. So before we get started talking about race and how and whether and why to talk about it in the classroom, I wanted to just put this slide up that comes from our Talking About Race issue that we did in 2016. And I started that issue of the Change Agent with this piece called "You Want Me to Do What?" And yes, we want you to talk about race in the classroom. And it's all students responding to that question about why they want their teachers to talk about race in the classroom. And I'm putting this out front because I want it to be clear that I think a lot of students want us to talk about this. And in this particular array, you hear immigrants saying things like, I got so many racist messages in my country of origin. And then when I came here, I didn't know what was what. And, I learned a lot of racism from Hollywood. And, when I got here, it was really helpful that I had a teacher who took it on head on. So this isn't just me saying it's a good idea to talk about it, that, our students want us to talk about it. So what is a first general strategy? I think this is so important for so many reasons for success in our classrooms, but certainly if we're going to embark on possibly hard conversations around race and racial equity, we need to have a sense of trust in the classroom and a sense of community. And I know every good teacher already does things like this. They create opportunities for students to get to know each other, and opportunities for them to show themselves, even developing ground rules together. So not just kind of announcing the ground rules, but having it be a collective process that is a generative process where people together decide what makes sense. Then there's a lot of buy-in on those rules, and it's easier for people to remember them and think about them if they actually played a role in creating them. But if you wouldn't want to dive into a potentially difficult conversation if you hadn't already had some community building in your classroom. And do people have ways that they've been doing that on Zoom? I wonder if anybody would want to share. In person, there was all sorts of things that we could do in certain ways to get to know each other, but are people teaching by Zoom, and have you figured out ways to help people connect with each other remotely?
Hi, it's Janet. I will not, it's not, oh God, here it's me purple. Not particularly jump into the difficult stuff, but fairly early on, ask people to drop a question into the chat and talk about what's a good question, just to sort of build a general place of communication. And then as things become more complex or not, and with certain groups explicitly developing ground rules, but trying to benefit from the chat when people are comfortable with the chat. So that's one way.
Yeah, using the chat. What else? What have other people figured out in terms of using our technology to get people to feel connected? Anybody tried anything? Okay, so, I'm not even sure what the lay of the land is for you all, if you are all teaching remotely or if it's hybrid, or sometimes it's remote and sometimes it's in person. Can anybody tell me that? Are you all teaching remotely for the most part? So Lisa,
first, if you want.
Go ahead, Donna.
I'm with West Bay, and we are exclusively remotely teaching, but we do face-to-face testing.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay, great. Yeah, Lisa says having people talk about things in their homes can work for making people feel more comfortable. Yeah, I know somebody who had people bring an object, to the Zoom, and to show an object, just to kind of as a way for people to get to know each other, and that was really effective. So another important general approach is to be transparent about what you're doing and why. And so if you are bringing up topics of racial equity in the classroom, I think it's just really important to say why you're doing it as a teacher. Don't just deliver it, but explain your purpose. And the persistence research says that actually when you are transparent about your purpose, that also fosters persistence. People know from the beginning, what you're doing, what you're thinking, and why you're doing it. So here are some reasons why you might want to lead with a topic of racial equity. One is it's just relevant to learners. It's something that all of our learners are experiencing, whatever race they are. It's a huge topic in the news. It's a huge dimension of every part of our social and cultural and political and economic life. You can't avoid it. It creates real obstacles for people of color. And so by talking about it and addressing it in the classroom, you might actually be addressing and ameliorating a real obstacle that people of color are facing. And that level of relevance, is another persistence driver. Also, just be really clear that you're teaching basic skills in the context of this content. You are teaching critical thinking. You're teaching people to read for evidence, when they write, to write with evidence. If you're teaching about civics, there's so many ways that the struggle for racial justice overlaps with civics. So you can insert a lot of racial justice conversation in the context of your civics classes. And you can just make it clear, like this is teaching US history, this is teaching US social studies. And it's not just you on an ideological pathway, you're meeting multiple needs in the classroom by teaching this content. A third general piece that I think is really important is that by teaching this content, you're connecting to this reality, what I think of as reality, and that is that nothing is written in stone. There's no part of human-made institutions that can't be changed. And in fact, we can all affect the flow of history. And in fact, history shows over and over again that regular people have had a huge impact on how systems work, how institutions work, and massive historical changes. Biases, systems, institutions, they're all movable, not easily necessarily, but with effort, they can be altered and changed. And this is really important because I feel like so many people in this country in general, maybe especially adult learners or not, I don't know, but there's a sense of fatalism often, like this is the way things are, you can't fight City Hall. There's nothing you can do about that. You have to just put your head down and keep going. And, but in fact, there is a lot you can do. And when you are closer to that mentality, I think it's actually really good for you as a learner because, you can alter where your future is going. You can take charge of your learning. You can express agency in all sorts of ways in small ways and large ways in your own life and your life of your family and the life of your community. So I think that, this kind of messaging really filters down in a powerful way for learners. And I think it's very uplifting, honestly. So that's a third general piece. And a fourth one is that we're going to bump up against student resistance and we need to be responsive to it. And I wanted to make this a little bit more of a conversation. I have some ideas about how to respond to student resistance, and I have them on a slide, and we'll get to those later. But I thought I would open it up first to our own conversation about, what's an example of student resistance and what that you've experienced in your time in adult ed, and what did you do about it? So I'd be curious to hear from people. Some people are currently not teaching. That's okay. Maybe you have a story from when you were teaching. I have many stories from when I was teaching of confronting student resistance. And what I mean is not just around talking about racial equity, but we get resistance in all sorts of different ways, right? And so I would love to hear what your strategies are, because it's going to build a bridge for us to thinking about how to have those hard conversations around race. Because I think it's the same skills basically that help you through any hard conversation are going to help you through a hard conversation about race. So does anybody want to, and I know this is kind of abrupt, like all of a sudden you have to rack your minds for a difficult conversation or example where you experienced student resistance, and then what did you do about it? Did the real Carrie show up? we had the fake Carrie who was actually Donna.
Yeah, she
And
did
now we
make
come-
it. She's here. And,
Welcome, Carrie. Yeah, does anybody have a story? And I guess, I mean, I have one in my back pocket, which I can share, and it might help you think of one. So in one of my classes that I was teaching here in South Boston, I had a student who I definitely was having a hard time connecting with. He wouldn't make eye contact with me. We didn't have any warmth between us yet, even though I was trying different ways to build a connection. And it just wasn't working very well. And one day I asked everybody to get into small groups, and he stood up and he pointed at me and he said, you know what? I don't like you very much. Has anybody ever had anything like that happen to them in the classroom? It was I felt so attacked and I felt so bad, and it made me feel so terrible. And all the first things that wanted to come out of my mouth were very harsh, punishing things, like, so I could get myself back. Like, and I wanted to say things like, there's the door. You know what? There's a door and you can leave. You don't need to be here. I don't need to, it was all very, yeah, just from a place like that, where I wanted to protect my little hurt self, that, and I don't know what possessed me to come up with this, but I remember wanting to point at the door, and I remember thinking, this guy's probably been shown the door his whole life, right? So I was like, okay, let me not do that, okay? So then what I thought of to say, and I don't know why I thought of this, but I said, oh, and why did you pick this particular moment to tell me that? And it turned out that it was really good, because what it did was he said, I don't want to get into small groups. You can't make me talk to these people. I don't trust people. I recently got stabbed, and he rolled up his shirt and showed us his stab wound, and everybody oohed and awed about the stab wound. And so he got attention for having been stabbed, and the trauma of that. And he also was able to express himself. He didn't want to get into small groups. And I had just said, everybody get into small groups, and so he got to say that he didn't want to do that. And he got to say why, because he doesn't trust people. And then I just kind of said, oh, okay, now we have a lot more information here. And then what happened is everybody in the class started talking to him, and it was a really powerful moment of realizing, like, somebody in the class pointed at me and said, she's really okay, which I felt like was highest praise. Oh my God, and so he got feedback from his peers, and he got recognition from his peers, and people asked him, what happened with the stab, and then, and he got to say how he feels about, not trusting people and stuff. And so it actually, a huge iceberg kind of collapsed, in the classroom, because he was gutsy enough to do this inappropriate and like hurtful thing, but honestly real thing, authentic thing that he was feeling. And I somehow managed to find the personal resource. And we can't always do this, right? We can't always find the personal resource to not have our feelings hurt, or not, feel defensive or whatever. I mean, we're just human. So does anybody have a response to that? Or does that call to mind a story that happened to you that was maybe challenging? Or you had to figure out, in this case, his resistance was to getting into small groups, which, don't you notice that a lot? People don't want to get into small groups.
I'll go a little bit. I have one. I mean, I don't know if I've ever anything quite like that, right? But things where I do get resistance about like doing things, and they may not understand the reason why we want to do things. But I found overall that once I explain the reasons why we're doing them, that they know it's not some arbitrary thing to make them feel embarrassed or noted of their shortcomings, which they have their own anxieties about. So I think just keeping in mind like where the people are coming from, and I mean, I'm sure it's ad nauseum for a lot of people, but my situations, I was similar. So I dropped out of school. I had these same kinds of anxiety. So I really do understand it most of the time. Sometimes I forget,
Right.
but I do, because it's been a while now, right? But like, I do, I think it's, when I do ever get resistance from somebody, I just try and explain why we do the things we do. And I think that's just giving them the respect to like understand they're adults. So, they should understand why we do it. We're not just doing it like I guess sometimes we get pushback from like the race questions and the ethnicity questions on the intake process. And I've heard other people talk about this before, but when you explain like that, this is, first of all, it's not for us, it's for the feds, and that covers your funding and that covers your tuition. So that
Right.
you don't have a student loan bill. That first is like first initial part, but also understanding that it actually does build equity, because without that information, how would the government know that they're covering enough people? So once you start to like explain why, people do have less resistance. But you just when they are resistant, you can't take it personally. You're just like, okay, they just don't understand.
Mhm.
That's what being a teacher is about.
So can you imagine a conversation about race and racism in your class where, somebody said, why are we talking about this? I don't want to talk about this. This is, there's various approaches people might have, like, this is painful. This is a painful topic. I don't want to talk about it. Or a person might just express blatant racism. Like, what would you do?
Are you asking me, or are you just asking?
Yeah, I'm asking you.
I think that the idea would be just to kind of like mine out like why we're feeling that way. And if it gets to be like too uncomfortable, like there is a time to stop. You don't want to just like keep needling someone when they're not capable or even aware of what's bothering them. But I think sometimes when you just open it up and just be like, well, what about this is upsetting, or or like just what's going on, like just being authentically like curious about what's going on. And sometimes it doesn't work, but I think most of the time it does.
I like that. I like that word, being curious. Not necessarily coming back with an answer, but just being curious about what the person's experiencing.
I'll just, because I work with Carrie, so I can't recall in all the time I've worked with Carrie, and I've been in adult ed on and off and in regular education for like over 25 years. I don't recall a single instance where there was a racial slur between students, not once. But with that said, you've described our typical student, like they don't like to talk initially until they get comfortable, until there's trust. And we have what I'll call oversharers. They like to talk about where they're from and their background, and this happened to me, and I grew up in this country, or I came to America this year, and we have stories, and it's just conversation. So we've been very lucky. We don't have what I would consider to be issues around that topic. Carrie, correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, they're all pretty congenial. We demand a level of respect for the teachers, fellow students, regardless where they're from, if they're male or female, if they're 16 or if they're 80. There's just a level of respect that is demanded and required, and that's just it. So I don't know.
Yeah, I would say that overall, like our student base is pretty good. Overall, people are pretty good. Every once in a while, there are sensitive topics that come up in the news, and people are feeling it, and so those can be sensitive times. Like I can think of like when the George Floyd protests were going on after that. After that situation, people were heightened, and they weren't necessarily talking about it like out loud, but you could feel the energy of people being distressed. And maybe that was that could have been part of my own, like maybe because I was feeling pretty stressed out about it. Maybe I was projecting, but I don't think so. I mean, we did have some talks about like how people were feeling, because it's a pretty traumatic event. So when there are traumatic events like that, I think it's important to like let people just be who they are and not hold any. I think Donna and I and the other rest of the group, I can't imagine, never seen anybody in adult ed not be sensitive to that. I mean, I'm not saying that there aren't people that do that, but I've never seen. I'm sure there are people who are not sensitive to it, but I've never seen people be insensitive to when people are hurting, because this is a job of people being empathetic and caring.
And I think too, We avoid gross generalizations and opinions unless they can back it up with some kind of factual information, because anybody can have an opinion about whatever.
Right.
And we always stress that you can't lump every demographic group or regional group or ethnic group into one big pile. Everybody's an individual, people make choices. And if you're going to make a statement about something, you have to have some evidence to back it up. You can't just be throwing your opinion around and be like, just because that's what I think. You have to have some kind of evidence to back it up. So I don't know, that helps to keep it a level playing field, and people can't just be throwing out their opinions randomly.
We mostly do that in the scope of the GED too, though, because like our focus is the GED. So the appropriate response is like, well, like if somebody was to throw out an opinion on the GED, they'd have to back it up. So, you know, it's okay to like have an opinion, like doesn't mean anybody has to like agree with it, right? Or disagree with nobody, you know what I mean? It's just, but I think we're all pretty, I don't know, we tend to get along okay overall.
Janet, did you want to add something?
Yeah, but Karen just came on. Karen, maybe you'd like to go first because I've already spoken.
Oh, okay. So I'll just say something kind of in line with what Carrie just said. I've been working with adult ed populations since 1996. And I, a lot of times, have been in situations where I'm the only white person in the room, but I'm really struggling to like think back to something that fits what you're looking for, because I was a high school dropout also, and I always share that with students because I know the effect that is going to have with them. I'm immediately like, oh, okay, she's not just, you know, like an authority figure, or it just changes things when it really does. And I think only other people that are in this situation can understand that, where a lot of times, you know, the students breathe a sigh of relief because they know, like when I'm talking about something, it's because I've experienced what they're experiencing. So I'm really comfortable with talking about this topic too. And I've generally taught, you know, GED prep and ELA, and it's really easy when you're teaching ELA, when you're looking at literature, to bring this up. It's really easy to bring this up when you're talking about currents, but I'm teaching math right now and it's on Zoom, two of my not favorite things. So I am struggling with it right now, you know, like how to approach a topic like this when I'm teaching math on Zoom. But my past experience has been really, really good. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that I'm so willing to be like, this is what we're going to talk about. This is how I feel, you know, like, how do you feel? And I haven't had a lot of pushback. I have had students, like when I was working in Woonsocket, say things that, like maybe calling somebody in the group that was Vietnamese, using the word Oriental. So, and not knowing that was an offensive term. So, you know, like being able to use that as a lesson where, you know, in a non-threatening way, non-aggressive way, saying that, you know, we don't really use that word to talk about Asian populations. And I mean, that's really the only thing that I can think of in recent memory where, and it was easy. It was easy. I had a good group and I had a good relationship with the group. So haven't had a lot of pushback.
Great. Thank you. Janet, did you want to add something?
Just quick. I'm working with a group of Haitian learners, adults. And when I was asked to take on the job, one of the questions I asked was, is there a conflict at the minute? It's overgeneralizing, but asking about conflict between Haitians and Dominicans. And I'm putting in the chat, some of you might be familiar with We Speak New York. There's a video called New Life Cafe And it's about a Dominican woman who has a cafe and she has diabetes and blah, blah, blah. And when I asked the two Haitian leaders of the program, they said, well, no, not really. And then this morning, we're talking about health and we did a clip from that. And there was a lot of the woman identifying, my name is Rosa, I'm Dominicana, and these are my recipes. And in the back of my mind, I was going, I knew not to ask explicitly, oh, guys, this is a problem. But the feedback I got from my students was, yeah, she's Dominican. It wasn't about her being Dominican. It was about diabetes and the doctor and the thing. But having that awareness and sort of thinking this could go sideways, this could like sort of turn on a dime. And it didn't, but I think to Karen's point too, sort of figuring out how people identify if like the Haitian Dominican conflict has translated itself back to Providence, Rhode Island or not. But I think we can't ever possibly know, but we can know that we don't know and try and be aware of that. And then super quickly, Karen, when you were speaking about not being a high school graduate, when I was working with a group of women in Canada, in my more ignorant, I'm still ignorant, but my even more ignorant days, one of my colleagues said, yeah, I never finished high school. And I said, well, that's okay. We're all the same. All right. So step back from your judgment, because that was my learning moment where I had skin removed without anesthesia, as well I should have. And so in our positions of power as facilitators, as educators, we need to be made uncomfortable. How we determine how uncomfortable we make learners is a whole other kettle of fish.
Great points. Great points. Thank you all. I heard a lot of great strategies in that conversation. This is my list, and I mean, on the one hand, it's pretty basic. It's stuff that I heard you all say basically just now, but I think it's worth just kind of going through the list. This idea of being responsive and not reactive, it's just a great human skill and a great teacher skill to not react. Because we all want to just react with our stuff, but to try to find another way to respond. And one of those ways is this, what we heard, I think it was Carrie saying, show curiosity, be curious. Or like in my story, I figured out a question to ask. I mean, by the skin of my teeth, I came up with a question. And so in those moments, if you can think of a question to ask to kind of dig a little deeper and find out what's going on, it could just be magic. And sometimes the question could be even just, could you say more about that? Right? I mean, that's one you can always have in your back pocket. And I've often used that with a student, if I didn't really understand what a student said, instead of just going, what? or I don't understand, or, that might make a person feel bad or something. I just say, can you just keep going, say more, because I'm, but also invite curiosity, not just show your own curiosity, but invite other people's curiosity about what's happening in the moment and get other people to have a question for the person. And allowing for this horizontal flow. So it's not always for the teacher to respond, you can invite a response from somebody else. And that could really open up a really useful conversation. I love this concept that I got from a teacher friend in the Bronx who has her students write for the change agent a lot. And she's also co-presented with me now a couple times. Her name is Kamala Red. She says, be a guide, not an expert, be a co-investigator. So if you can just position yourself as not the person who knows all the answers, but a person who's also interested in investigating, even when somebody says something kind of, I remember one time in one of my classes, we were doing current events and gay marriage had just become legal in Massachusetts. And one of my beloved students said, if my son were gay, I would murder him. And it was just such a blow, it was, and just, how to respond to that, in that moment, and how to keep the conversation, you know, all of a sudden my whole lesson plan just went out the window because of that little bomb that got dropped, you know. And sometimes you got a bomb might get dropped and you just, it's like, okay, and we're just going to keep going. You know, we're just going to, I have a lesson plan. We had something we need to do today. We're just going to keep doing it. And that's where that last one comes into play, you know, be authoritative, not authoritarian, but you know, you're in charge, you're the teacher, you're trying to help support people to get through to meet their goals. So you can't necessarily always be derailed. But sometimes you might be effectively derailed, and it might be a good thing because it might be great practice for speaking and listening, great civics practice for thinking about opinion versus fact, a great opportunity to go learn more, research more, find out, why do you think that? Where did that come from? What's the evidence you have to back up that point? So those are my, okay, so Carrie says, can you clarify? That's when I like to. And what clarify what, Carrie?
Oh, not that you can clarify. I'm sorry, that I was just saying that when somebody says something like your person who dropped the bomb, right? Like you might ask for a little bit of clarification because she could be speaking metaphorically, or maybe there's something going on. Like maybe she didn't mean those words, but not realizing how they might sound because it might be perfectly normal in her family environment, but outside. So it's one of those things where like, I probably would say, oh, could you clarify what you mean by that? And then have them think about what it is that they said, because in a different situation, it might cost them a lot more than in a situation in our classroom. So just thinking about like, not being like a jerk about it, but like, because people say stuff off the cuff all the time that they don't necessarily mean like literally, right? But at the same time, those things could have consequences that they don't realize. So it's important to kind of flesh it out and say, well, what do you mean by that? Like, that's a great point. Also, you know, even if you didn't mean it literally, in fact, he did mean it. He did mean it when you know, that's what came out. But also just, you know, there could be people in the class who are gay, right? Who now have been potentially traumatized. Exactly. I mean, and then as a teacher, how do you navigate that? You know, and do you let it just go by and just keep going with your lesson plan with the messaging being, oh, people can say stuff like that and get and we just keep going? Or do you pause, or, you know, what do you do? And so I typically find I don't want to hog up the thing, but I typically find that like when I've done things like that, when I have spoken unfairly, which of course I have, right? When I've said things that were like ridiculous or out of line, when someone calls it back on me to think about what I've said, it's always been helpful. Right. So I just feel like that's the most helpful and respectful thing, is to give the person the opportunity to think about what they've said. Right. I love that, Carrie. That's great. Can we just put another bullet on here? Just create enough of a space for a person. I sometimes think of it as holding up a mirror. You know, let me say back what I just heard. Is this what you meant to say? You know, just that is another really great way to respond. Any other thoughts? Okay, so let's get into some more specific strategies now, and I'm going to actually send you on a little bit of a field trip. So the strategy is, this comes from Riva, the person who I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar. She talks about, you know, talking about racial equity as survival English, okay? Because issues of race and equity are just as important in US society for survival as, you know, being able to successfully go to the grocery store or open a bank account or talk to your doctor or your kid's teacher. And so she made this whole Google lesson plan, and it's available on Google Slides, called Talking to the Police. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to ask Joan to share the link, but I have it open right now too. And I wanted to show you a couple things before you look at it independently. The first thing I want to show you is that on the first slide, there's this little note that says, you know, who created the slides, you know, and then there's a whole, you can use them as they are. Notice that the slides are in view only, so you can't manipulate the slides. If you have the link to it,
you can view it. Anybody with the link can view it, but you can't manipulate it. Now, if you're the teacher and you're looking at these slides and you go, you know, I really want to add a quiz here, or I want to add vocabulary there, I wish I could adapt these slides, you can. If you have a Gmail account or a Google account, you just go up to File and you click on Make a Copy of the entire presentation. Now you own the slides and you can do whatever you want with them. If you don't have a Google account, you can just download the slides into, say, PowerPoint. And again, now you own it. You just save it on your own hard drive and you can do whatever you want to it. And this is important because, for example, down on slide 17, Riva made a quiz using Google Forms on the vocabulary related to getting pulled over by the police. Now, if you shared this Google form quiz with your students, Riva, would get the results, right? Because it's her form. You want this to be your form, so you would need to make a copy of it. But you know, it's kind of all done for you, but you just would have to make the copy so that you're the owner of it, so that when your students take the quiz, the results would go to you. Does that make sense? Looking for little nods. Yeah, I see them. So the two things to notice are that you can adapt, you can use it as is, or you can make a copy and adapt it in any way you like. Okay, so with that, I want to ask you to just go off and take a look at it. And I think the link is in the chat now. So you can click on it and just scroll through. You'll see how Riva set it up, and then just come back and maybe be prepared to talk a little bit about what you thought of it. What would you do? How would you adapt it? How would you use it? So just take about 2 more minutes and then we'll like to come back and share a little bit about what you noticed. So I see Janet writing lots of open-ended opportunities here to build schema, develop problem-posing codes, work with local information and issues as well. Thanks, Janet. What else? Did anything strike you as interesting, surprising, useful? Would you use something like this? There were a couple of videos embedded. Carrie says the fill in the blank was useful for vocabulary. Yeah, a lot of great vocabulary and really good survival English. The way that she came about this is that she realized, she was a white teacher with a whole big classroom full of Haitian students, and just kind of like, they haven't had the schooling that Black Americans raised in this country have had about talking to the police or getting pulled over by police and what might happen there. And so she realized it could be a helpful thing to make sure they have the proper vocabulary. Yeah, and their police situation at home is, she says a lot of thing that comes up is that, not to offer bribes. I mean, in a lot of countries that our students come from, it's like the right thing to do is you just offer a bribe to the police, I mean, that's kind of the appropriate thing to do, but not in this country. Yeah, not just bribes, but yeah, a lot of differences. Lisa says, I think the lesson is good and have used something similar. I think this is a good example of a race conversation that isn't explicitly about race, but for everybody. Yeah. Great. And then, the articles from the change agent, when I was looking at this lesson, I was like, I may or may not use those articles from the change agent. I don't know if I would. One of them is especially very provocative. It would just depend on my group. It would depend on who was there and what the dynamics in the classroom were. But there's some of those articles that are a little bit more provocative and edgy than just kind of like looking at the vocabulary around being pulled over by the police. Any other thoughts about that?
I could see possibly where, like, depending on who the teacher was, like you could have someone who's, just doesn't think that these would be necessary to talk about. Like, I'm just thinking about like when you like, okay, like you have like how you have to explicitly say, oh, I'm putting my hand in my pocket to get my ID. This might not be, I mean, it really does depend on the person who's being pulled over and the neighborhood you're being pulled over. There's all kinds of different things that go along with it. So I can see where some teachers might feel like that's overkill, or like, even though I don't necessarily think it's overkill, I can see how that might be something that could be difficult for some teachers to talk about.
Yeah.
Because they haven't seen that as their experience.
Right. Right. Anybody else want to?
I just wanted to say that I got schooled on this a long time ago when I was working in Worcester and like fresh out of college, and coming from a small town that's very white and being taught by my students how this was a real thing. So it made me, think of all the times that this topic has come up, and it's definitely a topic if you're teaching a 3-hour class that you want to do at the end, towards the end of class, because once, a lot of students will get emotional about this topic because it is emotional. It's, I've worked with people that have spent time in jail for things that I know people that have done similar things and they have not spent a day in jail. So it just made me feel like a lot of empathy and you know, remembering how important it is to, you know, bring up these things, even if it feels like it's really present in the news today. A lot of our students don't watch the news. So it is really important to bring up.
Right. And I mean, you're teaching math, I think you said. I mean, there could be a lot of really interesting data to bring in to look at.
I actually, just a couple of days ago, I'm always fascinated by the fact that people climb Mount Everest, considering how expensive and time consuming it is. And I did read recently that the first Black group of hikers is climbing Mount Everest. So we are following that story. So,
Oh, wow.
so yeah, and it's a very interesting story, and it involves race too, but in a really kind of innocuous way.
Yeah, sideways, you know,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
there, but that's not the focus. Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Great. I call that being race adjacent, which is
Yeah.
actually a term that comes up later in this webinar. Okay, so just rethinking what is survival English, and trying to, you know, if you're a white teacher, you know, actually, you know, seeing if you can kind of school yourself a little bit here for what your students might need. That is one of the strategies. And then remembering that this is everyday English, that being able to talk about race and racism, and certainly a lot of that vocabulary in the being pulled over by the police lesson plan is everyday English. Some of the words that you're hearing, you know, one of those lesson plans that we have, we talk about the word matter, you know, like this phrase, Black Lives Matter. And the term matter is a great English word to play with. There's so many different ways you can use that word. But just, there's a lot of everyday English here that you can use. I should be in this mode. One of Riva's points is, you know, connect with what you already do and make small changes so you don't overwhelm yourself. So, you know, if you are trying to kind of contour your teaching so that it brings in the question of racial equity a little bit more often, because it matters, you know, because this is something, you know, as we've talked about, that our students face and that we want them to be able to have the tools to address. You don't have to just rewrite everything. I mean, you're teaching civics, you can bring in an article about, you know, say voting rights and racism around voting rights. I mean, certainly that is a huge topic in the news right now. My sister-in-law is the president of the League of Women Voters in Florida, and she just sent me this link where she's in the news talking about how they're going to have DeSantis wants to have a new police force in Florida to monitor voting. Now, imagine what that's going to do, how much voter suppression that's going to cause, right? There's a very strong dimension of race in that strategy that they're using. So, but yeah, if you're talking about civics, you can bring in questions of racial equity, and it's not the center point necessarily of your lesson, but you're bringing in the terms, the language, the context of the role of race in civic participation. Lots of mini lessons when this, says Joan Ford, and Carrie says, I think it underscores the necessity to listen to the experiences our students are having. Yeah. Okay, a final specific strategy is to choose materials that reflect the fullness of everyone's lives. So this doesn't mean, I think a lot of times people make the mistake of, oh, we're going to talk about race in the classroom, so therefore we're going to talk about racism. And, you know, all the things that are unfair and all the injustice that happens and all the racial inequity in this country, which of course there's a lot of, and we could talk about that all day long. But I think an important way to also bring in race is like what you just said. I think it was Karen, that you're talking about Black people climbing Mount Everest, because Black people climb mountains too. I mean, you know, Black people are just full humans. And so just showing them in the fullness of their lives, and all people of color, all people, because white people get to be portrayed in the fullness of their humanity all the time, but people of color often don't. And so that is a way to address racial equity in the adult ed classroom. It's not always necessarily talking about struggle and historical movements for social change, or, you know, horrible injustices, which of course we know are there and are real. But it's also just people being family members, people being community members, people climbing mountains, people playing music, people celebrating holidays, you know, all the things. So I think the other thing that's really good there too is that it just gives you an opportunity to bring up topics that are fun, that are celebratory, that are beautiful, that are, you know, examples of Black excellence, and that just infuses a whole piece of joy, you know, into the classroom at times. And to not wait till something comes up. So don't wait for, you know, there to be some big thing in the news like George Floyd or Mike Brown, but you know, to have this running through all of your content all the time, because partly it's just the right thing to do. It's part of, you know, our country is made up of very diverse communities, and we should be infusing that into our teaching. But also because then when something does come up, you have a groundwork there, and people have the words at their disposal, and they have the experience talking about things together. So on that note, I have another field trip for you. And so I think you're going to end up getting a copy of these slides. So you'll get all these links. These are all hot links. And these 4 lessons right here, these are all Google slides like the one you just looked at. And you see number 2 is talking to the police. So you already looked at that one, but there's also 1 and 3 and 4, which are just very specifically racial equity lessons, right? I mean, they're taking it on head on. But I'm not going to have you look at those right now. I'm going to have you look at these race adjacent ones, which is a way to center the stories of people of color, but not in a way where you're talking about oppression per se, or racial oppression per se. So I'm asked, I think Joan, Joan's putting the links in the chat. And it would be great. I think we have time for you to look at both. Just click on both of them, open them up and check them out. The first one is Moving from Anguish to Power. It's a story of 2 African-American women who in their apartment building fought to not have to pay a huge rent increase. And the second one is about endorphins and how exercise gives you access to this natural remedy. So take a few minutes and check out those 2 slideshows. So what did you look at? So Donna has to go. Oh, you're right, she's on the phone. Okay, that's cool. I understand. We're all juggling too many millions of things. But yeah, what did you look at? Did anybody look at the From Anguish to Power one? Annie and Betty? Aren't they amazing?
I thought that was really cool. I don't know if you know this, but on PBS right now, there's a special, and it's called The Reckoning in Boston, and it's about what's happening in Boston right now with exactly what this article is about. So,
Oh my God.
like, I got to be honest with you. When I used to work at Ryrel in Woonsocket for like 5 years, and I used to use the change agent all the time because I was teaching ELA. Now I'm working in Providence at Crossroads, and I mean, we used to get paper copies, so I just don't see them, but I'm glad that I came to this training today because I totally like forgot how much like the students like to read these items because it was other students writing it.
Right. And we don't publish in print anymore because the pandemic.
Yeah.
So, you know, the PDFs are online.
Mm-hmm.
The audio versions of our articles are online. It's sortable by level. I can take you over there and show you that if you want me to.
I just went into the site. I've already navigated it. So yeah.
Did you find,
that's really cool.
I hope you found the index with all the articles so that you can sort it by level so your students can, I'll put the link in.
I'll put the link in. Will.
Yeah. Well, thanks for saying that. I love Annie and Betty so much. This was in our mental health issue. And I love that they're basically, you know, one of the comments Annie says is, I have mental health issues. And my doctor said, keep doing what you're doing. Like this process of fighting for herself has been like her best therapy, and making friends with Betty and going to the meeting together and not being alone and breaking down the isolation. And they're just two amazing Black women, you know, fighting for their rights as tenants and human beings in the city. So yeah. And racism is certainly a part of the housing story, right? Like there is a way that racism plays out in gentrification and in who kind of makes a community better and then gets displaced from that community. Like they say they fought to have the T, you know, the T is what we call the subway. You know, they fought to have a subway station put in right by their apartment building. So now they're priced out of their apartment building. So they added to the social, you know, the social value of the area, but they don't get to benefit from it. So anyway,
I
what do
think
you
those
think?
stories like this are so good for the classroom though, because it reminds people that they do have the power to make change, and it, you know, that like it can feel, I don't know. I mean, I was born and raised in the United States, not on the East Coast, but you know, this can be a very overwhelming and oppressive society, regardless of who you are. So just recognizing that sometimes you have other people that have a vision similar to yours, and you guys can join together to make a better thing, no matter who you are,
Right.
is helpful.
Right.
Because this is a tough place to live. I mean, it's easy in some ways for some, you know, there's some, you know, like, I don't want to say it's like, it's not the same as some other countries, right? But there are other countries that have other benefits that are set up. So like, it's,
Yeah.
It's a little good and bad. And it's a matter of like, when you can see that people can invest in their own community, it reminds them that they have support there, even when it doesn't feel like they have support. And this is the most important part of living here.
Yeah. What about the endorphins one? Anybody look at that?
I did. I was impressed it was a student. I did. When I first looked at it, I didn't catch on that it was a student. So I was like, oh my God, a student did this. This is great.
Yeah, actually, when I looked at it again, I realized I wish we had put the student's picture at the front of the slideshow. The student's picture doesn't show up till the very last slide. And so you don't really realize that it's a student until the very end. But yeah, it's a student.
And that's brave. That's brave because she's talking about mental health, and that can be really difficult in this arena.
Well, check out our mental health issue. on the change agent, I can't remember, it's issue 52 maybe or something. It's, if you go to our issues tab and scroll down, you'll see it. It's fairly recent. We did it right after the pandemic issue because everybody felt like, the mental health issues that were kind of surfacing in part because of the pandemic.
Sure.
But yeah, you hear all these students talking about, their strategies for dealing with mental health challenges. And so I like it that we gave voice to students to talk about it themselves. So yeah, that is, and the change agent is a great source of material for this, reflecting the fullness of everyone's lives, because we publish stories by students and very, diverse students from all different immigrant communities, non-immigrant communities, people from all over the world, people at all different levels of English language proficiency or literacy, so it's very, very diverse and it's all their voices. So you just get, using the change agent itself is a contradiction to the racism that is part of everyday life in this country. So on that note, I have another slide where I want to just mention this woman in this pictured there with her 3 kids. She is from We Make the Road, New York. I think she lives in Brooklyn. Anyway, she writes about how suddenly we became teachers. Suddenly she was like homeschooling her 3 kids. Suddenly she had to get high-powered internet. She had to apply to the city to get devices for her children. Then she was supporting her neighbors and her other parents at her school, her kids' schools, to get devices and to fill out the applications. And she just became like a community organizer / technological expert / homeschooling mom / just everything. And it's written at her level of English. And it's just a great story of a person taking charge, of a situation. And again, not explicitly about race, but about race in some ways. You can click on this link and you end up in a part of all of our articles have this opportunity for you to comment, on the web page. So part of like a homework assignment or even an in-class assignment could be go read this article and then leave a comment underneath. And that's a great digital literacy skill too, right? Like responding appropriately online, responding to other people's comments, that kind of thing. And then in our hair issue, yes, we did a hair issue. There's this wonderful poet who submitted this poem. And then I asked her if she would, usually our audio is honestly recorded by me, so, or if it's a male student, I find a man in the office to record, to read the audio. But in this case, I got her to read her poem and it's really beautiful, and so just another opportunity to share content. I wanted to raise that we have a new call for articles out, and it's our next series of issues is going to be on immigrants and immigration. And I put the call kind of at 2 different levels, a sort of an intermediate level and then a more beginner level. They're on our website. Can you see the link there? If you could, maybe Joan, I don't know if you could grab that link and put it in the chat. That would be great. Yeah, so have your students write for the change agent. Why not? If they get published, they get a $50 gift card, they get to kind of correspond back and forth with an editor. Part of the correspondence is part of the whole learning writing and appropriate writing for an email versus writing an essay for a national publication. It's really, people tell me all the time that their students feel like even if their piece gets rejected, they feel like they were treated like a writer. And that's this big leap forward, to be treated, to think of yourself as a writer. Then you approach your next writing assignment with a whole different kind of inner mentality or inner story about yourself. So check out the call for articles. I want to leave you with a few just clear directions about what the change agent has. I mean, in addition to every single issue addressing race in one, whatever our topic is, we talk about race. So our transportation issue explicitly talks about racism in the transportation industry and things like that. And every issue has people of color raising their voices to talk about whatever that issue is, and they might or might not be talking about racism. But we also have very pointed attention on race. So we did an issue called Talking About Race, where you can find all sorts of great stuff. We did one specifically on Indigenous peoples. Again, a great opportunity to get the voices of Indigenous people talking about, you know, what they're facing. And then, like I just said, any issue of the change agent is going to have a race lens. And then there's a lot of lesson packets that deal with race, but I want to specifically point you to this one, which is about best practices in the classroom. So there's a lot of more content there for you to check out. Okay, so I want to leave you with my email address, and you can always reach me through the through our website. I think there's a contact page there, but yeah, I'm going to put my email address in the chat, and just encourage you to reach out to me with any questions, or if you try any of these things that we did today and you want to let me know how it went, you can just email me. Also, at the end of, I think, all of our little Google slideshows, there's a form you can click on to fill out, to just say, how did that go for you? Because we only just recently started doing these Google slideshows, and we want to hear what people think about them. You know, honestly, just the people on the ground doing the work and trying to teach. I've never taught one of these things, so I don't know how it goes. So I would love it if you did one of them and you would like to give us any feedback. We would love to hear it. That's what I have for you today. I know that Joan has an evaluation and that she would like you to fill out, and I'd be happy to pause and let you all just do that on the fly right now. And also just ask if anybody has any final questions or comments about anything that we talked about today. Thank you to, those of you who have spoken up. I really appreciated hearing from you and just hearing your stories. And to everybody else who's trying to simultaneously write grants while they participate in webinars, I hear you, I get you. I'm sorry that you have to keep so many balls in the air, but thank you for being here anyway.
Any other comments for Cynthia? She'll be, and actually, if we don't end up having comments, you are presenting in about 3 weeks. I don't know, do you want to talk a little, I'm sure you're in process of putting that together, so you're not going to.
I am, but yeah, just a little.
And it's a very different kind of focus than what we're doing right here. So
yeah, it's very different. We're gonna be talking about racial inequity in the workplace and in sort of income and wage levels, and because I want to talk about it in the sense of being clear about what's out there for our students, what we're preparing the world that we're preparing them to go out into and what they face, and having a clear understanding of that as teachers helps prepare people to engage and not just manage it privately, but perhaps shift it, right? So that's what that one's going to be about, a very different kind of a workshop.
And even with that said too, as you mentioned, people are writing grants and that kind of thing. And a lot of their outcomes have to do with work and the workforce and training programs and such, and I think we all want to make sure that we're aiming students towards programs or trainings where they're going to make a decent salary. It's not just a job, but it's a better job or it's a career. So, there may be ideas that even come out of what you're going to talk about that help people think even a little bit more deeply into, what they're proposing for the next 5 years. So you can see that being a real thing.
Yeah, so hopefully we'll see some of you back in March. I can't remember the date off the top of my head. Is it March 10th maybe?
I want to say March 1st, March 1st.
March 1st,
That's the
okay.
first one.
Um,
Same day of the week, same time.
okay, yeah. Does anybody else want to say anything? I got a private message from Uduak Ime. Thank you for being here. Sorry if I just mangled your name. And thanks to everybody.
Also, I'm going to pause our recording as well. So
Yeah,
if any
that's a good
questions
idea.
on that, that's.
Yeah,